I know for all of us, something sparked us to get involved in economics. We're interested in knowing what sparked you in getting interested in economics and become a teacher, philosopher, and everything like that.
Great. So everyone's any kind of major in the room, or not necessarily, just in general in the business school? Economics. Got it. Okay. Great. So great question. So as Paul mentioned, I'm originally from Jamaica. So Jamaica, West Indies, not Queens. So from the Caribbean. And we moved, my family and I moved from Jamaica to the United States when I was about 9 years old. So that was in 1978. And one of the first things you notice when you move from a place like Jamaica to the US is how much better off people are in terms of their standard of living. So I didn't have a tough childhood, didn't want for anything growing up, but in Jamaica you're never very far away from poverty. And I grew up in a really rural environment. I know I don't sound like I'm Jamaican anymore, but I am. I was born there. And grew up in a really rural environment. We lived on 20 acres in the middle of nowhere when we lived in Jamaica. And we didn't have a telephone. No one in the immediate vicinity of where I lived had a telephone when I was a kid. And so I remember moving to the United States, and we left Jamaica. I didn't know this at the time, but in large part because the economy was really in a tailspin in the late 1970s. We had a prime minister named Michael Manley, I'll say more about this later today, if you come to the lecture, who was experimenting with something called democratic socialism, and was putting in place a number of economic policies that really just undermined economic growth. So there's a lot of increasing poverty also when we left Jamaica. And I just remember moving to the United States, moving to suburban Chicago, some of Midwesterner, a little town just north of Chicago. And I remember just seeing a very different level of standard of living going on. And that just really got my attention. So I knew I was going to go to graduate school in economics. I wanted to really, as you know, economics is a lot of math in it, and I wanted to get prepared for that. In the English system, they say you read for a degree, and they really mean that. So at Oxford, when I was studying mathematics, there are a number of university lectures. So let's say you were taking a course in differential equations. There would be a set of university lectures on differential equations that you could go to, but that lecturer, you never saw outside the class. So it was literally a big public lecture with maybe 150 students, but you never had any interaction with that professor. You then would go back to what's called your college. So Oxford is made up of like 30 different colleges. And then you would have a tutor at your college who would assign you work to do based on the lectures that he knew that you were going to. But a lot of the degree was basically just doing problems on your own and reading books, and it was a much more independent degree. So I was glad I'd done the American system first and then done that degree, because I think that would have been pretty tough to do it the other way around. But the value of that was I really learned that I could get through really difficult material on my own, and it helped me develop to be a more independent learner. Thank you. Now, one of the other things I should just say is that, I don't know whether you know this, but in the British system, so I did a second undergraduate degree. And in the British system, when you do an undergraduate degree, you only do one subject. So I imagine you guys take courses outside of the business school. In Britain, if you major in economics, you only do economics for all 3 years. That's all you study. So you go pretty far in depth. So the bachelor's degree there is in some ways like a master's degree. And that is pluses and minuses. You get to go a lot deeper, but you miss some of the breadth that you get in the U.S. system. So I felt really fortunate to have the opportunity to do it the way that I did, basically being in the U.S. undergraduate system, then having a chance to go deeper in England. Thank you. Yeah, well.
Most students in the U.S. decide to usually stay within the U.S. They might travel to other states, but they don't usually consider studying abroad as an option? How did you come to that conclusion that that was the best option for you?
Well, I was really fortunate. I had some really, I'm sure you guys have had some professors who have been pretty influential in your lives. And I was really fortunate my sophomore year to run into a professor who actually has given one of the Gorlin lectures here named Sandy Darity, and William Darity Jr. So when I met Professor Darity, he's the one who first of all suggested that I think about getting a PhD in economics. So I was taking these econ courses and doing pretty well in them, but didn't know what I was going to do with a degree in economics. So I was thinking about going to law school, and he said, why don't you think about getting a PhD in economics? So I'm coming in a roundabout way to answer your question. And I was interning one summer in New York City before my junior year in college. It was before my senior year in college, actually. And he, so my junior and senior year, before my junior year, actually, before my junior year. And I got a little bit bored towards the end of the summer. I wrote to him, and he sent me back a bunch of articles that he'd written. And I got really fascinated by it and told him I thought maybe he was right, maybe I should think about getting a PhD. So when I started to kind of go down that track, he also then suggested that, he said, look, you're doing really well in school. Why don't you consider applying for a fellowship which would allow you to study in England for a couple of years. And he told me about the Rhodes Scholarship and the Marshall Scholarship. And I was fortunate enough to win one. And for me, it was also really fortunate as well because I hadn't taken all that much math in my first 2 years of college. And so I was really trying to catch up and take a lot more math to get ready to do a PhD in economics. So to have the opportunity to go to England for 2 years and just study math to get ready for my graduate work in economics was actually just a really fortunate thing to have.
Would you suggest that as an option for other students as well?
Absolutely. So one of the things I would say in general is just there's a whole world of opportunities out there that you're probably not even aware of. I know I wasn't aware of, and it's a lot easier to find out that information now. I mean, in the old days, you had to go to the place on campus for international fellowships. I'm sure there's probably still such an office here, but there's so much you can just do now online. And everything from there's the Rhodes, there's the Marshall, there's something called a Churchill Scholarship, there's a Fulbright Scholarship. I'm sure there are others that I'm leaving out. People have given money, and if you're a good enough student and you're ambitious and you are willing to put in the sweat equity, there are fellowship opportunities out there that are waiting for you to apply and compete for. So I would definitely recommend it.
I have a question. Out of all the institutes that you have attended, which would you say was your favorite, and which do you feel like you gained the most from? I know you kind of talked about the different perspectives.
Right. That's a great question. I won't dodge it. I think I got different things from different places, but my undergraduate institution my education was probably the most formative time of my life, intellectually. So I went to school. Paul mentioned I played sports in college for a couple of years. So I went to school as a student athlete who wanted to get good grades. And then I met this professor that I talked about, Sandy Darity, and he really just opened up a different world to me. I never, my mother was a college professor, but I never thought of being a college professor myself. And the interaction that I had with him, I wrote an undergraduate thesis with him, took a course with him, and most importantly, he just was open and had conversations with me about the potential career paths. He took an interest in me. And that just opened my eyes to a potentially different life, and had a huge impact on me. So I have to say my undergraduate education is probably the biggest overall impact in my career, because had I not had those experiences as an undergraduate, I wouldn't have even thought about the paths, like doing scholarships abroad or doing a PhD. And as much as I got out of the PhD program when I was in graduate school, as much as I got out of being a student in Oxford, I wouldn't even have thought about those as possibilities if it hadn't been for my undergraduate education. So I would say obviously my undergraduate education is probably the most formative.
Anything else?
I can add just one thing to that, as well, so we think about their question. I mean, also, my undergraduate education was just really, and like in this room, there's folks from a lot of different backgrounds. It was just a real eye-opening experience for me, you know, being in a different part of the country, being in North Carolina. I never spent any time in the South before. Culturally, it was a new experience. So it wasn't just the in-classroom intellectual part of it, it was just the social part of it as well. It was just a very different set of interactions, different set of people, and living in an environment with folks who just thought differently than I did, had different life experiences. It was just really powerful.
Question. When we discussed Jamaica in our economic development class, the finance minister was quoted as saying that the IMF holds the handle and we're holding the blade. What is your opinion on the relationship between Jamaica and the IMF?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the IMF has a difficult job of holding countries to task, to do things that they'll find really hard to do on their own. Jamaica's had a long history with the IMF. I think in the past, a lot of Jamaican policymakers have tried to blame things on the IMF that I think that they should hold themselves accountable for. So I think it's, countries typically don't go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to ask for money until they're deep in the hole. And typically they're deep in the hole because they've pursued a set of policies that haven't produced the economic growth, and they've borrowed a lot of money and haven't generated the returns to actually service those loans. So they're already in pretty difficult positions by the time they get to the IMF. So it's, so it's, in some ways they've turned the blade on themselves already by the time they get to the IMF. Now I think the IMF's come a long way since the 1980s when Jamaica first started having interactions with the IMF. And I think that the IMF has become a little more flexible in the way they deal with countries. And most recently, Jamaica's experience with the IMF, I don't know when that quote was from, but Jamaica's had some success under the most recent IMF program. Countries actually started growing again, even though they had a number of really difficult measures. And I don't know whether you're aware of this, but Jamaica just had an election, and there's a new government in place. So one of the big questions is whether the new government is actually going to stick with the IMF program. I think they'd be wise to actually stick with the program. I don't know if does that answer your question? Yeah.
Here, education is stressed as like the key to uplift yourself out of poverty, but I know it's probably a little bit different when you're consumed in it, or when you said the sheer difference of poverty levels in Jamaica and America were amazing. So would you say education will be the key towards uplifting that nation as well, or maybe there's more of a short-term solution that they should be pursuing?
I think it's not either or, I think it's both of those things. I think that education, at a personal level, has been a huge difference in my life. I mean, I told you I didn't come from a hard background, but my parents were the first in their family to go to college. And my parents had scholarships to go to, high school, undergrad, and grad school. So without those scholarships, and without that access, their lives would have been very different. And they're just a microcosm for what education does more broadly. As you studied in your classes, you can invest in physical capital, but it's also important to invest in human capital. When workers become more productive, they can earn a higher wage without undermining profitability. So everybody wins. And the way to do that is through education. So in developing countries in particular, one of the big needs in the 21st century is, so in the United States, we've gone through a transformation, right? There was a point in time where, high school education was sufficient, particularly in this part of the country. You could do really well. Work at Ford, work at GM, come out of high school, and be set for life. Things are not as easy as they used to be. Now it's, then it was getting a college education, and now sometimes you've got to get a master's degree. In developing countries, a lot of the jobs that used to exist in this country have moved offshore, moved to different countries. And there's going to be an increasing need for manufacturing in developing countries. But the workers in those countries are going to need skills as well. And so the developing countries are at a place probably where we were in this country, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago in terms of what their skill upgrade needs to be. There's a great need for investment in high school education, secondary education in developing countries. So education is still, it's a big part of the long-term answer. I think we've got to do a better job in this country in particular of finding ways to not only invest in people to get college degrees and beyond, which we really think of as being as credentialing, as well as educating, but also just figuring out how we create more opportunities for older workers who are already in the workforce to certify and upgrade their skills in a way that's demonstrable to the workforce so that they can actually capitalize on that investment more quickly. Because we're going through challenging times in this country. I think challenging times in developed countries as well right now. Because there's a lot of income inequality. The last decade and a half has been really challenging for a lot of people in not just in developed countries, but not just in developing countries, but in developed countries. Good question. Yes.
You had mentioned that the workers need an education to become more productive, but they also need technology. And how did a country like Jamaica go about getting that technology? Or the machinery and stuff like that to go with it? So
I think one of the great lessons of economic history is that being open to trade, being open to investment, is really important, not just for getting capital, but for getting ideas in the country as well. And often with machines come embedded technology and know-how. And so the opportunity for workers to have the opportunity to work with the latest machinery, the latest equipment, whether it be computers, network equipment, and digital technology, or more industrial technology. Countries that have closed themselves off in the world market, as Jamaica did for a period of time, really suffer as a result of that. They suffer because they experience less investment, which has a direct impact on reducing wages. But it also has the impact of closing the country off from technology and depriving workers of the chance to actually upgrade their skills. But I would just add that the ability to work with new technology is heavily affected by your education level. And more generally, the way the world of work is going, it's more and more important to have flexibility in what you're able to do. And so, an education gives you very specific skills, but when you're solving those calculus problems that you need to solve for your econ classes, and you think, well, gee, I'm not going to actually solve an actual calculus problem on the job. That may be true, but the thinking skills, the analytical skills that you're developing, trust me, and I see it in terms of the people that work for me at Stern, they're not solving calculus problems, but we never quite know what task is they're going to have to do, and their ability to think on their feet and be flexible problem solvers. That's what companies are really looking for, problem solvers, right? So yeah, it's important to have very specific skills in accounting, economics, and finance, but companies are looking for problem solvers.
I have a question about
Wouldn't free trade zones within these developing countries, especially Jamaica, prevent the spread of technology and of the knowledge that these foreign direct investors are bringing in?
So is your question about whether they should have free trade zones within the countries or trade with the rest of the world more broadly?
I meant like, wouldn't they stop slow the spread of the knowledge and technology that you were talking about coming from trade, because they'll do their work within those free trade zones, not within the rest of the country.
Oh, I see. So your question is about spillovers from free trade zones?
Yes.
Yeah, so the pros and cons of free trade zones. I think most of the experience has shown that when countries establish free trade zones, those are generally good for the country, particularly for the workers in those zones. But it is a question as to whether the kinds of spillovers that you want to have happen really do happen as a result of those trade zones. So yeah, so your general point is right. I mean, you want technology coming into the country to not just affect a narrow group. You want wide access to that technology, and the best way to do that is just generally to open the country to free trade.
Okay. Thank you.
So in the U.S., there's been like a drastic increase in like the price of higher education, as you can see by like large quantities of student debt being formed. Do you think that coupled with the fact that the world, particularly the U.S. in particular, is becoming more dependent on higher education, do you think this almost prohibitive cost of higher education could lead to some long-term problems for the United States in the future, or?
Yeah, so the rising cost of higher education is a major challenge. I think it needs a multi-pronged solution. So universities certainly have to continue to do all they can to mitigate the rising costs. Just so you understand, it's a big challenge for universities, because universities compete for talent. You might not think of it, universities compete for talent with major corporations in the following way. So the people that teach you in class are business school professors. They could be working for Pricewaterhouse or GM or other places. And as the demand for people with PhDs and second and master's degrees and post-baccalaureate degrees goes up because of technology and globalization, the underlying cost structure of higher education goes up because the majority of the cost structure of higher education is professors. So that's part of it, and I think over time technology is going to help mitigate that. But also there's responsibility, so universities need to do all they can to think about how we make the best use of faculty time. But then corporations, you think about it, benefit from this huge pool of labor that we generate called college-educated students. So if you think about it from an economic analysis point of view, there are these positive externalities that accrue to companies that operate in the United States because of our higher educational system. And as you know from studying economics, anytime there's an externality associated with something, there's generally positive externality, there's generally under provision of it. In this case, you can think of almost of companies hiring students out of the job market as like fishing in a common lake. Okay? But companies aren't. Companies do some things, but not a lot, to help repopulate that lake. So I think there's a strong argument to be made for companies to have to bear some of the cost of trying to subsidize, frankly, this public good, which is college-educated students. So colleges need to do all they can to maintain, to try to keep costs from rising as quickly as they are. But that's going to be very hard because of supply and demand. So the right way to address the problem is to increase the supply, which is about increasing access to higher education. So I think the major corporations who benefit from hiring folks like you when you finish have an obligation to pitch in even more to help increase the supply of talented students like you by creating more access. And I'm sure all of you, I encounter students all the time who have a challenge financing their education. I'm sure you personally know people who might like to be here, but face financing challenges. And so what we have to do is find a way to create more access for students who are qualified to go to college but don't have the means to do so. I think companies need to play a big role in that. So yeah, it's a challenge, and it needs a two-pronged approach, at least a two-pronged approach. I'd also add, just to add to that as well, actually maybe three prongs. What's the government's role in all this? Well, if you think about the way our tax system works, we subsidize up to $1 million a year of debt if you buy a home. But nothing on that order of magnitude exists for writing off investment in college education. So if we want to incentivize investment in human capital, we need to think about our tax structure as well. And putting incentives in place for people to invest in our labor force. So those are my thoughts on that.
I have a question about your book.
Okay.
It's called Turnabout, and your subtitle is Third World Lessons for First World Growth. It almost sounds like we could learn some lessons from what's happening for the first world. Is that the implication?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So what is the book about, and pique my interest because I might want to read it.
Yeah. So if you think about the countries there today are called emerging markets. They're what's called third world countries. China, India, Brazil, South Korea. And they became emerging markets and transformed themselves from third world countries to being emerging markets by undertaking a number of reforms that the gentleman in the black shirt alluded to earlier about the IMF. Okay? So the IMF basically, starting in the mid-1980s, imposed a number of changes on a range of countries. And with fits and starts and to varying degrees of emphasis, a number of these so-called third world countries undertook reforms and did so to dramatic success, really raised the standards of those countries. Okay? Undertook what are called structural reforms. Ironically, it was the United States and many countries in Western Europe that actually, through their leadership of the IMF, pushed this reform agenda on the developing world. Fast forward to the global financial crisis. We had a financial crisis, but more deeply than the financial crisis, there were a set of structural issues with the economies of the United States and Western Europe that we're still struggling with. And so it's ironic that we in the United States and Western Europe, we taught the third world what they needed to do to start growing, have been unable in the last decade to undertake many of those same reforms that we need for ourselves. So in Europe in particular, you know all the problems with the Eurozone. Germany's doing really well, running large surpluses, and the rest of Europe is basically in deficit because Europe's really unproductive. And Europe needs labor market reform and a number of other structural reforms to make their economies competitive. But the IMF has been unable to get Europe to actually undertake those productivity enhancing reforms that Europe needs to actually start growing again. So whether it's the United States, and for a while we were in this country we were still pursuing real expansionary monetary policy. But for a while we were pursuing fiscal austerity. Think of the fiscal cliff debates, right?
Yeah.
So we were pursuing policies that were kind of working against one another. For us, I think in this country, the bigger structural issue is an educational issue. We've been talking. How do we really get serious about upgrading our labor force? In Europe, the issue is labor laws, making it easier to hire foreign workers so that firms will be more eager to hire workers. There are some major structural reforms that are needed in advanced economies, but I think largely for reasons of pride and hubris, we're able to see the historical parallels. Another example would be Greece. Greece needs those reforms, but going back to countries like Mexico and Brazil in the late 1980s, they needed reform, but they also needed debt because they just got too heavily indebted. And when countries get overly indebted, it's a problem not only of the debtor, it's a problem of the creditor, because creditors extending too much money. And so the way that we resolved that crisis, global debt crisis, was countries had to reform, but the creditors also had to accept what we call haircuts, you know, writing out some of the loans that they own. And I don't know of any, I know, well, I should say I don't know of any. I don't know of many people who looked at Greece that thinks that Greece can actually pay their debt. And it's really ironic because the country that's been pushing hardest for Greek debt to not degree is Germany. And Germany, of all countries, should understand history.
Yes.
I don't know how much economic history you guys have studied, but in the period between World War I and World War II, Germany had hyperinflation, which led to the rise of the Third Reich and other things, largely because after World War I, France insisted on Germany servicing its debt. And so you got, if you guys have heard of Keynes, John Maynard Keynes.
Yes.
So Keynes, in addition to his famous book, The General Theory, wrote another book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was about the consequences of basically, I guess, the Versailles Treaty after World War I, which basically insisted on Germany paying its debt. And so German debt actually had to be forgiven post-World War II. And so the Germans have a short memory.
It sounds like they're very averse to, their heavy monetary policy, because that's what threw them in, that's what threw the Weimar Republic into hyperinflation. Well, perhaps that's why they're not so keen on that.
So I think that you're on the monetary policy, you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of us agree that right now, central banks have done almost all they can do to help stimulate the economy. But then there's this issue of just the overhang of debt increase. And literally just, progressive writing off that debt. And the issue is that debt is largely held at this point by countries like Germany, who are loath to forgive any of it. But, we've seen this movie before.
Yeah.
Yeah, Professor Cochran's been driving really hard for us to form a definition of economic development. Would you mind giving us your definition?
Yeah. So, development and growth are not the same thing, but I like to focus on economic growth because without economic growth, you can't do any development. So, unless you raise per capita income on a steady and consistent basis, life becomes a zero-sum struggle. And I think we're seeing more and more signs of that in this country and other parts of the world. So for me, economic development means creating more opportunity for people to have dignity and work, for people to be able to get beyond a threshold subsistence standard of living. But none of that is possible without economic growth. So that's not as crisp a definition as I'd like it. That's the best I can do right now.
Do you have any opinions on the development of the African trade bloc?
Don't know a lot about the African trade bloc.
I know it's not like finalized yet, but I found it quite interesting.
Yeah, tell me some more about it.
Like they were modeling it on the premise, what they got out of the article, I think it was by The Economist, was that they were modeling it on the goal of the EU to reduce conflict, and it's quite hard. I found that surprising for Africans to move about the continent of Africa, to cross borders. So it would have the same goals as the EU or what came before it. So
yeah, I think in general that's a good thing. There are many large countries in Africa, and Africa is one of the fastest growing continents on the planet, both economically and also population-wise. and removing barriers to the free movement of goods and people within such a large block of people and content, I think is a good thing.
You see any challenges to that happening?
Well, there are borders. Yeah. Governments are not always eager to give up control. And then usual kind of conflict issues. Without knowing a lot of detail, I think there will be the usual kind of cross-border challenges, but I think that it's important to create more intra-African trade as well as trade between Africa and the rest of the world, especially with such rapidly growing populations. I mean, the sub-Saharan Africa, and so just kind of word on what's happening demographically around the world. In advanced countries, the labor force growth is really slowing and actually is declining in some places, like Germany and Japan, certainly the Soviet Union, well, Russia, not the Soviet Union anymore. It's a little Freudian slip there, thinking of Mr. Putin, I guess. So labor force growth is slowing in advanced countries, but it's actually booming in a lot of the developing world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, places like Nigeria. We're going to account for something like 60–70% of labor force growth over the next 25 years. I'll say a little more about that this afternoon, but so anyhow, you've got rapidly growing populations like that. I think free movement of labor is going to be really important, as well as free movement of goods.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I guess in your current like research or anything like that you've been reading or else, what do you find like the most fascinating issue and kind of like why is it so interesting to you?
Yeah. So what I'm really interested in right now, and I haven't had a chance to spend much time on this as I would like to spend on it, is I'm thinking more about I call sort of longer run economic trend issues. So I'm really interested in the interaction between demographics, particularly the rapid growth in the working age population in the developing world, and what I'm seeing as a increasing trend towards what I would call populism or sort of anti-capitalist sentiment, meaning that I think in some ways the social contract between capital and labor that really produced a lot of the gains in particularly advanced countries in the post-World War II period. We're seeing really strong fault lines there. I was saying earlier the challenges that the middle class in this country has seen in the last 15, 20 years with rising inequality, real wages are rising as quickly, and I think people are becoming increasingly frustrated. And I think I think a lot of I haven't been in this country all that long. I've been in this country since 1978, but people in this country a lot longer than I have, who are older than I am, we just had a conversation about it at lunch, are wondering whether their kids are going to have the same opportunities that they did. I think that's always been kind of the American promise, right? Your kids are going to have a better opportunity than you did. And with slowing growth and rising inequality, I think that promise, that social contract, is increasingly under strain. And when that happens, when there's slow growth, you get into the zero-sum mindset of thinking, well, the answer to our problems is to keep out foreign goods, or not let U.S. companies invest abroad. And that might help a few people, but it doesn't help the country as a whole. And it's short-sighted in that if we've got millions and millions and millions and millions of people coming into the labor force in other parts of the world, and we're increasingly in an environment in which we're seeing fewer, lower and lower capital flows, well, someone's got to build the factories to employ those people, to produce the next, whether it's China, it's moving on from China to Vietnam, and maybe the next wave of major manufacturings in Nigeria That's sort of the natural cycle of manufacturing to move from high-cost to low-cost countries. But if we don't allow the movement of capital to take place, to absorb the labor force growth, massive labor force growth we're going to see in the developing world over the next 15, 20 years, then you think about what's happening in the migrant crisis right now in Europe, which is, of course, precipitated by war in Syria. But there's the potential for a much larger scale, slower moving long-term problem of basically people looking for work who can't find work. And to think that, just, an ocean is going to protect us from that, I think that's a little short-sighted. So that's a very kind of long-run view of the world, but but I think a lot of discussion right now is losing sight of the fact that global growth is a positive-sum game, not a zero-sum game. And to be fair, I think in this country we've not done a very good job for the last 10, 15 years of actually really making sure that those who have been hurt by globalization have the opportunities they need to actually reskill, retrain, and get reintegrated in the workforce in a meaningful way. I think we've paid pretty short shrift to that, and I think we're paying the consequences of that right now to some extent. So I'm hopeful. I think that there are people who are thinking about this. I think the problem, though, is ironically the political climate, because we haven't paid attention to these issues, and there's been increasing frustration, there's little patience to actually hear a real dialogue about the complexity of these issues right now, at a time where we actually need sensible solutions to these complex problems.
I guess as a sort of like a follow-up, obviously one of the bigger long-term solutions that you think would probably be like vocational training programs and sort of like higher education, like mitigating the cost of higher education. You said companies, corporations contributing to that. Like, are there any sort of like short-term fixes that we can do, even just like solve that sort of short-sightedness, or anything that you see?
Yeah, I think there are a lot. I think you mentioned some of them. I think one of the things that I know some people are working on right now. It's interesting. I was just made aware of this. We also have a matching problem in this country. So there are platforms that do matches between workers and corporations looking for workers. My sense, and it's not a particularly informed sense because I haven't studied this carefully, but much of that really takes place at the very high end of the labor market. But the thing that I just learned a few weeks ago is there are a lot of Americans who don't have college degrees who are capable of doing jobs that are currently only open to folks with college degrees. And so figuring out how do we create more certification of these people, ways to be able to demonstrate skills rather than credentials. So all you're going to get a great credential, you're going to get a degree from Open University. So you're getting real skills as well if you're doing it for your professors, but you're also getting a credential. So you're getting two things, right? There are folks who don't have won't have your credentials, but who, by dint of having been in the workforce, they may not be in the workforce right now, but because they have 15 years of accumulated experience, they're tasks that they're capable of doing. But the traditional way in which we sort people is just on whether you've got a college degree or not, and it turns out that's pretty inefficient. So I think there are some things that can be done right now. And I know some folks who are actually working on these problems. But we need a whole array. We need a whole array. And with technology now, there's no reason why you can't do some of these things.
You would think the community college system would jump on this and try to corner that end of the market.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I know we've all got a lot more questions. I've got a couple I'd love to ask you. Probably double the time, but I think we have to wrap it up. So.
Great
I want to
questions.
thank you for coming and thank you for all the questions. It's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.